Sarah's piercing scream tore through the luxurious tranquility of the mansion in Maple Creek, Connecticut. It ricocheted off the high walls, skimmed across the polished oak floors, and vibrated the carefully framed photographs on the mantelpiece photographs of a boy with a radiant smile and eyes sparkling with intelligence. But the boy standing before her now was completely different. "Leonard, look at me," Sarah ground out, her voice cracking with fury. "Do you see this?" She waved a stack of test papers in front of her 12-year-old son. At the top of each sheet, the bright red letter F was like a splash of blood, a searing accusation. These were Leo's grades from Northwood Prep, a prestigious school with a tuition that could make one's head spin. Math F, History F, Science F, English Literature. Leonard, for God's sake, even this is an F. Her rage reached its peak. "What the hell is wrong with you? You're the kid who won the state spelling bee last year. Your science projects were legendary at your old school. And now this, a complete failure. All the money your father and I have poured into this, all the tutoring sessions, for this." Leo flinched at his mother's every word. He stood there, a small and pathetic shadow in the vast living room, his eyes welling with tears. "I studied, Mom. I swear," he said, his voice trembling. "I read all the chapters. I did all the homework. I understood it. But when I sit in the exam room, when I look at the paper, it's just gone." "Gone." Sarah laughed harshly, a sound devoid of any mirth. "Intelligence doesn't just disappear, Leo. That's the worst excuse I've ever heard." "But it's true," Leo sobbed, tears finally streaming down his cheeks. "It's like there's a wall of fog in my head. I know the answers are somewhere behind it, but I can't reach them. I couldn't even remember my own name on the history test until there were 5 minutes left." Sarah stared at her son, her anger beginning to clash with a creeping sense of unease. Leo's words, as absurd as they sounded, were uttered with a desperation that was terrifyingly genuine. She had seen her son study hard. She had seen him sit for hours at his desk, his eyes glued to the pages of his books. He wasn't lazy. So what was happening? "Don't lie to me, Leonard." She said, her voice a little softer but still sharp. "Are you being bullied? Is someone bothering you at school?" Leo shook his head vehemently. "No, everyone's fine." "Then it's the video games. Is it that iPad?" She pointed to the tablet lying on the coffee table. "All right. From now on, no iPad, no TV, no friends, until I see A's on these papers." "But Mom, it's not that," Leo said desperately. "It has nothing to do with those things. There's something wrong with me." "The only thing wrong," Sarah roared, her anger flaring up again, "is your attitude." She strode forward and snatched the thick science textbook from Leo's hands. "You are going to sit down and study this chapter again. I'm going to sit right here and watch you. You will read every single word out loud until it's etched into your empty head." And then something strange happened. The moment Sarah's fingers touched the hard cover of the book, a chilling cold, a cold that went straight to her bones, shot through her. It wasn't like the cold of a New England winter. This was a different cold, an empty, soulless cold, as if the very life had just been sucked out of her. Her head swam. The room suddenly tilted. The scolding words that were about to pour from her lips vanished. What was she about to say? What was she angry about? What was her son's name? Leo or Lee? What was this book about? The diagrams of cells and planets looked alien, as if she were staring at indecipherable ancient characters. A wall of fog. Leo's words echoed in her mind, no longer the excuse of a child, but a terrifying prophecy. She was in it. She was right inside that fog. A profound panic rose in her chest. She tried to cling to a coherent thought, a memory, anything, but it all slipped away, dissolving into a cold white void. She stood there, frozen, her eyes wide as she stared at the book. Her hand was still on the cover, the icy sensation spreading, numbing her arm. She could hear her own heart pounding in her ears, a distant and misplaced sound. "Mom!" Leo's voice full of fear. "Mom, are you okay?" His question was like a lifeline. Sarah blinked, and as if a curtain had been lifted, the world rushed back in. The dizziness passed. Her thoughts snapped back into place. She remembered who she was, who her son was, and why she was so angry, but the echo of the emptiness remained a horrifying aftertaste in her mind. She snatched her hand back from the book as if it were a venomous snake. Warmth slowly returned to her fingers, but a shiver still ran down her spine. She looked down at the book, then up at Leo. The anger on her face completely replaced by an expression mixed with confusion and primal fear. You feel like that?" she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "Every time you take a test?" Leo nodded. Fresh tears welling up, but this time not from sadness, but from a glimmer of hope. For the first time, someone understood. "Yes, exactly like that. Everything just disappears." Just then the front door opened and Michael, her husband, walked in. He loosened his Armani tie, the exhaustion of a long day on Wall Street etched on his face. "I'm home," he announced, then paused as he took in the scene. His wife looked as pale as a ghost, and his son was crying. "What's going on here, Sarah? Why do you look like you've seen a ghost?" Sarah couldn't answer. She just stared at the textbook lying on the floor, as if it were an object from another world, a vessel containing something evil and inexplicable. Her rage had vanished, replaced by a new fear, a fear that Leo's problem wasn't laziness or rebellion. It was something much, much worse. Michael set his crocodile leather briefcase down on a velvet armchair, his gaze sweeping from his wife's pale face to his sniffling son. The atmosphere in the living room was thick with something heavier than the silence after an argument. It had a strange feeling, an unsettling stillness. "Sarah, tell me what happened." Michael repeated, his voice calm and controlled, a habit honed from thousands of tense meetings and multi-million-dollar deals. He walked over, placing a hand on his wife's shoulder. It was tense beneath his palm. "It was the book," Sarah whispered, her eyes still fixed on the science textbook, lying face down on the Persian rug. "When I touched it—" "Michael, you're not going to believe this." "Try me," he urged gently. She took a deep breath, trying to piece together the fragments of what she had just experienced. "I touched it, and everything in my head disappeared. I couldn't think. I didn't know where I was, who I wasn't even sure what Leo's name was. There was just a cold emptiness, like a fog, just like Leo said. Michael, it sucked my thoughts away." Michael listened in silence, his face betraying no emotion other than concern and a hint of skepticism. He was a man of numbers, of tangible data and quantifiable strategies. Thought-sucking fog did not belong in his world. "Honey," he began gently, "you've been under a lot of stress these past few weeks. Leo's grades, the pressure from the school. Maybe you're just exhausted. You've overworked yourself and your mind is playing tricks on you." "No," Sarah whirled around, her eyes flashing with a combination of fear and anger. "This wasn't fatigue. It was real. Don't you understand? I felt it. It's what's happening to our son." Seeing the genuine panic in his wife's eyes, Michael knew it was pointless to argue right now. He knelt down and picked up the book. It felt normal, a hard, slightly glossy cover, pages that smelled of ink and paper. He flipped through a few pages, looking at diagrams of the Krebs cycle and the structure of an atom. Nothing unusual. "I don't feel anything," he said, his tone matter of fact. "It's just a book, Sarah." "Because you're not the one trying to learn from it," she retorted. "Or maybe it only affects us." That thought was even more terrifying. "Believe me, Michael. Please. There's something very wrong happening here." Michael stood up, still holding the book. He looked at Leo, who had stopped crying and was watching his parents with wide, hopeful eyes. He looked at Sarah, who was trembling, her usual strength shattered. His family was on the verge of a collapse he couldn't comprehend. But he had to do something. He had to come up with a plan, a logical solution. "All right," he said, placing the book on the table with a decisive thud. "I'm not going to say I understand what you just went through, because I don't, but I believe you felt something, and I believe Leo is struggling. He paused, choosing his words carefully. However, we can't jump to the conclusion that a textbook is stealing people's intelligence. That sounds irrational. There has to be a logical explanation. Maybe Leo is suffering from a type of extreme test-related anxiety. Some form of psychological block that causes his brain to freeze. And you, Sarah, being so worried about him, experienced a sympathetic panic attack when you touched the source of his stress, the book. It was a perfect Michael explanation, logical, psychologically grounded, and entirely devoid of the supernatural. It framed the problem in a neat box that modern science could address. Sarah wanted to scream that he was wrong. That feeling hadn't been a panic attack. It was an invasion, an externally imposed void. But what could she say? That there was a curse in their son's school books? She could hear how insane she sounded. "So, what do we do?" she asked, her voice weak. "We go to the best," Michael declared, shifting back into problem-solving mode. "I've heard of a Dr. Evelyn Reed. She's the top child psychologist in New York, specializing in learning and anxiety disorders in gifted children. It's hard to get an appointment, but I'll make some calls. We'll take Leo to see her." Leo flinched at the sound of that. "I'm not crazy," he mumbled. Michael walked over and knelt in front of his son, placing both hands on his shoulders. "No one is saying you're crazy, champ. But it's clear you're hurting, doctor. Reed is just a smart person who can help us figure out why your amazing brain is playing tricks on you during tests. We're a team, right? And our team needs a little professional coaching. That's all." His delivery was reassuring, confident. He had turned a frightening situation into a manageable action plan. Sarah looked at her husband, feeling both grateful for his steadiness and profoundly disappointed. He didn't believe her. Not really. He was treating her and Leo as problems to be solved, not as the victims of the menace she had felt. "All right," Sarah finally agreed, feeling drained. "We'll try it your way. We'll see the doctor." That night after Leo was in bed, Sarah went down to the living room. Michael was sitting in the dark, illuminated only by the glow of his laptop. He was researching Dr. Reed. Sarah quietly sat in the chair opposite him. She couldn't shake the feeling of dread. "Michael," she began. He looked up. "I've almost secured us an appointment for next week. I had to pull a few strings." "That's not what I wanted to talk about," she interrupted. What if the doctor doesn't find anything? What if she says Leo is perfectly normal, just like we thought he was before?" Michael closed his laptop, giving her his full attention. "Then we'll explore other possibilities. A different school. A different teaching method. We'll take it one step at a time, Sarah. Logically." But Sarah knew with a cold certainty that ran down her spine that this problem was beyond the reach of logic. It lurked in the pages of books waiting in the silence of exam rooms, and it was slowly erasing their brilliant, vibrant sun. She glanced at the textbook, still lying on the coffee table. In the dim light of the room, it no longer seemed like an inanimate object. It seemed to be watching them, a vessel full of emptiness, patiently waiting for its next chance to touch a mind. The drive to Manhattan was a journey of heavy silence. Michael drove their Mercedes G-Wagon with intense focus, his eyes glued to the traffic on the Merritt Parkway. For him, this was a mission: identify the problem, find the expert, execute the solution. He was in his element. Sarah, in the passenger seat, felt as though they were driving into a foreign land. She stared out the window, the brilliant autumn foliage of Connecticut blurring past, but her mind wasn't there. It was trapped in the memory of the book's cold touch of the terrifying void that had swallowed her thoughts. In the back seat, Leo was huddled in a corner wearing headphones with no music playing. He just wanted to create a barrier, a private space no one could reach. He had overheard his parents' conversation. A psychologist. That meant they thought he was crazy, or worse, that he was making it all up. The feeling of betrayal hurt more than the fear of the fog in his mind. Dr. Evelyn Reed's office was on the 30th floor of a glass and steel building overlooking Central Park. Everything about it exuded minimalist luxury: pristine white walls, modern Scandinavian furniture, and a massive abstract painting that was worth a year's tuition at Northwood Prep. The space was designed to be calming, to project an air of absolute order and control. But to Sarah, it felt as cold and sterile as a laboratory. Dr. Reed was a woman in her 50s with perfectly coiffed salt and pepper hair and sharp, intelligent eyes behind rimless glasses. She greeted them with a professional smile and a firm handshake. "Thank you for coming in," she said, her voice calm and melodic. "Michael gave me a brief overview on the phone, but I'd like to hear the story from both of you." They sat on a gray leather sofa while Dr. Reed took an armchair opposite them. Michael began. He laid out the problem clearly and coherently, as if giving a report in a boardroom meeting. He spoke of Leo's sudden drop in grades, his history of academic excellence. The symptoms Leo described: his mind going blank, temporary amnesia during exams. He skillfully framed it as a classic case of performance anxiety in a gifted child. When it was Sarah's turn, she hesitated. What should she say, her own crazy truth? "There's something Michael left out," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. She looked at her husband, then directly at Dr. Reed. I felt it too. A few days ago, in a moment of anger, I grabbed Leo's textbook, and instantly my mind went blank. Just like him. I couldn't think. I was terrified. It wasn't a psychological feeling, doctor. It felt like an attack." Dr. Reed listened intently, her fingers steepled. She nodded empathetically, but her eyes retained a cool objectivity. "Thank you for sharing that, Sarah. It's not uncommon for a parent who is deeply empathetic to their child's stress to experience similar physical symptoms. It's known as a sympathetic response or a contagious panic attack. It speaks to the strong bond between you and your son." She had explained it away. She had given her terrifying experience a neat psychological label. A wave of frustration washed over Sarah. Michael was nodding in agreement. He had been validated. Next, Dr. Reed spoke with Leo alone. The office door closed, leaving Sarah and Michael in the silence of the waiting room. Sarah got up and paced. "You see, she doesn't believe me," she said quietly. "She thinks I'm crazy too." "She doesn't think that Sarah," Michael replied, his voice still calm. "She's doing her job. She's looking for the most rational explanation. And let's be honest, her explanation makes more sense than a haunted textbook, doesn't it?" An hour later, the door opened and Leo emerged, followed by Dr. Reed. His face was blank, unreadable. "Leo is an exceptionally bright and articulate young man," Dr. Reed began once they were all seated again. "We talked and I had him do a few short cognitive tests and puzzles. Outside the high-pressure context of a formal exam, his intellect is razor-sharp. He shows no signs of a learning disability or cognitive decline." Michael let out a soft sigh of relief. "However," she continued, "based on Leo's descriptions and what you've both told me, I believe we are dealing with a case of acute performance anxiety disorder, coupled with a coping mechanism known as cognitive avoidance." She explained it in clear psychological terms. Essentially, the pressure to maintain his high level of achievement has become overwhelming for Leo. His subconscious has created an escape hatch. When faced with the ultimate stressor, a test his brain effectively shuts down to protect him from the perceived fear of failure. The fog, he describes, is the manifestation of this shutdown. It's an extreme but understandable psychological defense mechanism. "And what about me?" Sarah asked, her voice sharp. "Was that a defense mechanism too?" "I believe it was an echo of your own anxiety," Dr. Reed answered smoothly. "You were so fearful for your son that when you touched the symbol of his failure, you experienced a version of that same shutdown." The diagnosis was delivered. It was logical. It was scientific. It was treatable with cognitive behavioral therapy and stress management techniques. Michael was completely sold. He discussed treatment plans, weekly appointments, and strategies he and Sarah could implement at home. On the drive home, the silence was even heavier than before. Michael, in his mind, had solved the problem. He had a diagnosis, a plan. He felt relieved. But Sarah felt a cold despair. They had gone to the best expert, and that expert had told her that what she felt wasn't real. She had been dismissed as an overly anxious, hysterical mother. She glanced at Leo in the rearview mirror. He was still staring out the window, but she could see a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. He didn't believe the diagnosis either. He knew the truth just as she did. Now it was the two of them against the world, against logic, against science, and against the very husband and father who should have been their ally. Sarah knew the therapy wouldn't work. The stress management techniques would be useless against the icy touch of whatever was lurking in her son's school bag. And she realized with a terrifying clarity that if she was going to save her son, she would have to find the answers herself, no matter how dark or irrational the path might be. The real fight had just begun. The therapy sessions with Dr. Reed became a routine part of the Johnson family's life, but they were like putting a bandage on a wound that was festering from within. Leo participated reluctantly, answering questions with monosyllabic replies and practicing breathing exercises he knew wouldn't work. He was slowly withdrawing into himself. The light in his eyes, the spark of curiosity and intelligence that had once made Sarah so proud, was now dim, replaced by a sullen resignation. Sarah followed the instructions of Dr. Reed and Michael, trying to create a lower-pressure learning environment. But every time she watched Leo struggle with his homework, she could feel it, a cold, invisible presence in the room, as if a shadowy thief were lurking, waiting to steal the words as soon as they entered the boy's mind. Helplessness gnawed at her, day by day. The turning point came on a dreary Tuesday afternoon. Michael was on a business trip in London, and Sarah decided to take Leo to his therapy session herself. As they were driving down Park Avenue, a sudden downpour began, a torrential November squall. Traffic ground to a near halt. "We're going to be late," Sarah muttered, her hands gripping the steering wheel. "Can we just not go?" Leo asked, his voice so quiet it was barely audible. "It doesn't help, Mom." Looking at her son's weary face in the rearview mirror, something inside Sarah snapped. The pretense, the effort of following a script she knew was wrong, it all came crashing down. What was she doing? Dragging her son across the city to see a woman who didn't believe their story while the real enemy lay dormant in his backpack. "Okay," she said, the decision sudden and absolute. "We're not going." She made a sharp turn at the next corner, pulling out of the gridlocked traffic. "Where are we going, Mom?" Leo asked, surprised by her actions. "We're going to find an answer," Sarah replied, her voice filled with a determination she didn't know she possessed. The real answer. She had no specific plan, just a hunch, a powerful urge. She thought about the school, Northwood Prep. Everything started there. The problem wasn't in Leo's head. It was in that school. She drove north back toward Connecticut. But instead of going home, she drove to a different place. A place where she hoped to find a different perspective, a knowledge not bound by modern psychology. The Greenwich Public Library was an old stone building exuding the solemnity of generations of accumulated knowledge. It smelled of old paper and polished wood, a scent that was comforting. She took Leo by the hand, walked past the bright main area, and headed straight for the archives in the basement. "What are you looking for, Mom?" Leo asked. "I'm looking for a pattern, honey," she said, her eyes scanning the dusty shelves. "I want to look at old Northwood Prep yearbooks. I want to see if anyone else has ever been like you." The archivist, an elderly woman with half-moon glasses, looked at them curiously, but directed them to the town's historical collection. Sarah began pulling out the heavy leather-bound yearbooks, starting with the current year, and working her way back in time. She and Leo sat side by side at a long oak table, turning the yellowed pages. They looked at the smiling faces of students from years past. Sarah pointed out photos of sports teams, drama clubs, and science champions. Gradually, Leo began to engage, pointing out funny hairstyles and outdated clothes. For the first time in weeks, Sarah saw her son smile, a fleeting but genuine smile. They went through nearly a decade without finding anything unusual. Sarah was almost ready to give up, thinking this was another one of her crazy ideas. Then she opened the yearbook from 12 years ago. "Wait, Leo said, his small finger pointing at a page. "Look, Mom." It was the page for academic honors. In the center, with the title, Valedictorian, was a boy with thick dark hair and a confident grin. His name was Julian Croft. But it wasn't him that had caught Leo's attention. It was the boy standing right next to him, the salutatorian. He had dark, deep-set eyes and a barely perceptible smile, one that seemed both smug and cold. His name was Damian Vance. That boy, Sarah whispered, a chill running down her spine. "There's something about him." She flipped to the next page and the next, looking for the name, Damian Vance. He was a member of the chess club, the math club, and the debate team. In every photo, he was in the background or on the periphery, often near the top students, and always with that enigmatic smirk. "Mom read this," Leo said, pointing to a small article in the Year in Review section. Sarah squinted to read. The headline was, "The Great Slide Valedictorian Falters." It told the shocking story of how Julian Croft, the school's shining star and a top candidate for Harvard, had unexpectedly and catastrophically bombed his final exams. He had failed most of his subjects, stunning teachers and classmates. The article quoted the headmaster as saying it was a case of severe burnout. Julian never made it to Harvard. He ended up at a local community college and faded from view. The biggest beneficiary of his downfall, Damian Vance, who had risen to claim the valedictorian spot at the last minute. Sarah's heart pounded. There it was. The pattern. The cleaning lady, she whispered, a memory suddenly flashing in her mind. She said something about a strange boy, a new student. She quickly pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she searched for the Northwood Prep staff directory. She found the woman's name, Consuela Martinez. She had been fired a few months ago for unfounded complaints about a student. Sarah searched for her name on social media in phone directories. Finally, she found an address. Leaving the yearbooks on the table, she grabbed Leo's hand. "Come on, there's someone we need to see." They found Consuela in a small, neat apartment in Stamford. She was a petite woman with tired but kind eyes. When Sarah, desperation in her voice, explained Leo's situation and what she had found in the yearbook, Consuela's eyes widened with a mixture of shock and painful validation. "I tried to warn them," she said in accented English. "The new boy. His name is Silas. Silas Vance." Vance. The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. "Damian Vance's nephew," Consuela continued, nodding as if confirming a terrible truth. "I heard the teachers talking. His family is very rich, very powerful. He transferred to the school at the beginning of the year. Soon after the best kids, they started to forget. Just like your son. I saw that boy. Silas. He was always borrowing a pen, borrowing a book. He would touch the other kids' backpacks when they weren't looking. Just a light touch," I told the headmaster. "He said I was making things up, that I was harassing an important family. He fired me. Every piece fell into place. It wasn't a curse in the books. It was a person. A family. Something passed down. A dark ability to drain knowledge from others with a simple touch. Damian had done it to Julian, and now Silas was doing it to Leo and the other children." "How do we stop it?" Sarah asked, her voice urgent. Consuela shook her head. "I don't know. It is not normal magic. It is something old, something in their blood. But one thing I know. It needs contact. It needs a conductor. Your son's books, his pens, they are contaminated." Returning home that night, Sarah felt a cold clarity. She was no longer afraid or doubtful. She had her enemy. When Michael returned from London the next day, ready to argue about a missed therapy session, he was met by a completely different woman. Sarah calmly laid out the yearbook and her notes from the conversation with Consuela on the table. She explained everything, not with the panic of a hysterical mother, but with the precision of a lawyer presenting her case. She pointed out the pattern, the names, the undeniable coincidences. This time, Michael didn't dismiss her. The cold logic of her story, the string of evidence, broke through his wall of skepticism. He looked at Leo, who was sitting quietly listening, and for the first time he truly saw the horror his son had been living through. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice low. "We are taking our son out of that school. Immediately," Sarah declared. "And we are throwing everything away. Every book, every pen, everything that has been in his backpack since Silas Vance set foot there. We're starting fresh." And they did just that. That night they filled 3 large trash bags with books, school supplies, and even Leo's backpack. They drove to the town incinerator, and under the cold fluorescent lights, they threw everything into the flames. As the fire roared, consuming the paper and plastic, Sarah felt an invisible weight lift from her shoulders. She looked at Leo. He was staring into the fire, and in the flickering light she saw something return to his eyes. A spark. They homeschooled Leo for the rest of the school year. Sarah taught him herself using brand new books and fresh pens. Gradually, slowly, the fog began to lift. Ideas began to connect again. The joy of learning returned. A few months later, Leo entered an online math competition and won first place. The Johnson family never looked back. They moved to a different town and enrolled Leo in a new school where no one had ever heard the name Vance. Sometimes Sarah would still think about Silas, about his family, and the dark gift they carried. She realized that the world contained things that logic and science could never fully explain. There were shadows that lurked just beneath the surface of normal life, and sometimes the only way to defeat them was not to understand them but to recognize them, name them, and burn them to ashes.